Good news, everyone. The gender pay gap doesn't exist, according to some keyboard warriors.
In reality, we've crunched the numbers ourselves, and the data shows that women on average are earning over $1 million less over their working lives than their male counterparts.
Hi, I'm Eliza.
And I'm Greg.
We recently wrote a report about the gender pay gap, looking at a few different dimensions of the issue, breaking it down by occupation and looking at the big picture impacts.
And our report found that men have higher average salaries than women in 95% of all occupations, including those where women dominate the workforce.
For example, women account for 99% of all midwives, and yet they're paid on average 19% less. And in Australia, the gender pay gap is more than double what it is in New Zealand. 15.3% in Australia compared to 6.7% in New Zealand.
And of course, you can imagine our delight when vast sections of the Twitter commentariat and gender equality experts were so forthcoming with revelations about how we were wrong.
So let's go through some of the common arguments that we've seen and explain the facts about the gender pay gap. The first myth is that the gender pay gap doesn't exist because it's illegal to pay men and women differently.
It is illegal to pay women and men differently for doing the same job if they've got the same experiences and they're working the same hours at the same time. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about the gender pay gap.
Yeah, the gender pay gap measures like average weekly earnings across the whole workforce. So it encapsulates the fact that men and women are actually engaging in the labour market differently. And this is because of a lot of structural barriers that women face in the workforce. And we know that women and men are unevenly distributed across industries and occupations, across types of different work, so part-time and casual work. So they're doing different hours, and this is why the gender pay gap exists.
Yeah, things like seniority, things like the number of hours you can work, where we're talking even within occupations, whether it might be teachers, might be doctors, might be administrators. They're technically doing the same job, but they're not working the same hours, they don't have the same responsibility, the same pay levels, and these are the things that we're talking about when we mean the gender pay gap. Myth 2 is that women actually choose to do lower paid work. Is this true, Eliza?
I mean, it's hard. Again, it's a difficult one. Choice is a really difficult word to use when we describe how we engage in the labour market. It's a really misleading term because a lot of the choices we make are quite constrained. We don't make them freely, and this really applies in this case. So, firstly, what we can say is there are a lot of structural barriers that women face when they're engaging in the workforce. So one of the biggest reasons why the gender pay gap exists is because women do an overwhelming amount of unpaid work in the economy. We found that women spend 81% more time doing unpaid domestic and care work than men. And of course, this means they can't do as much paid work.
What we found is that even in households where men and women do roughly the same amount of paid labour, that women are much more likely to do more unpaid labour and much more likely to do more unpaid care work. But what the reality is that because women are so much more likely to be doing more unpaid work, they are then more likely to be working part-time paid labour, doing shorter hours, and actually taking on less responsibility, which often means having to work more hours because they have so much responsibility in sharing that load of unpaid labour.
Exactly. And of course, you don't find part-time and temporary work evenly distributed across the economy. You find it concentrated in low-paid sectors, which is why women end up in low-paid sectors. They do a lot of unpaid work, they end up having to do less paid work, and because of that, they end up in education, health, particularly things like aged care, disability care, and childcare, which we know are notoriously underpaid. So coming back to this point of choice, right? The other thing is, what really influences what we do in life with our paid work is what we see around us, right? So, yes, it's true. Women are concentrated a lot in low paid sectors and insecure work. And partly that reproduces the problem for the next generation. I don't know about you and what you wanted to do when you were young and you aspired to be, but it wasn't an economist for me. And maybe that's because there aren't enough female economists.
And it's also a thing that because women are expected to do all this unpaid labour, employers assume that they're going to be doing it, and that feeds into this whole gender pay gap because they are given fewer hours, fewer responsibilities, because it's just assumed, oh, you'll be taking care of the kids.
Myth number 3, women earn less because they take time off to raise the kids.
Yes, this is a big one that we often hear about, and it's always sort of couched as though, oh, this again is all about choice, that, oh, this is almost the natural way of things. But the reality is there are a huge raft of policy settings behind this, which actually make it more difficult for women to keep working and men to be the ones who take time off to help raise kids.
Absolutely. We know, for example, that parents face some of the highest out-of-pocket costs to put their kids into childcare in Australia. And because of this, it really forces the responsibility of child rearing onto households. And then within a household, there has to be a decision that's made about who's going to spend time looking after the kids. It usually ends up being the lower income earner. And guess what? That usually ends up being a woman. So we have policy settings that are in place that mean that women do end up taking the lion's share of raising children, and they do drop out of the labour market often to do this. The other thing is paid parental leave. It used to be, and it's only just changed, that the entitlement for the largest share of paid parental leave was only assigned to the birth parent. Guess who that is? A woman.
And so it's a case of, while people might think, oh yes, my grandmother or my mother, depending on how old you are, was the one who took time off. And isn't that how it always is? The reality is, over the last 30 and 40 years, women have come much more into the workforce than in the past, in ways that, you know, in the 1980s when I was growing up, no one would have ever assumed so many women would be working. It was seemed, oh, it's just natural that women don't work, they stay home. None of these things are natural. They are all things that are driven very much so by policies. Myth 4, there's no gender pay gap. It's just that women work fewer hours and they just have less responsibilities.
Not true, not true. So actually, if we want to literally engage with this point, the gender pay gap that's most often cited, the 13.3%, actually refers to average weekly earnings for full-time workers, and it's the difference between men and women. So this gender pay gap, or this measure of the gender pay gap, actually controls for working hours, and guess what? It's still there.
And what we very much found is that if you remove that and you actually look at just total workers, so average earnings of all workers and not just full-time, what do you guess? The gender pay gap gets even larger. So we've always been of the view that you should look at average earnings for all workers, not just pretend that, oh, there's a similar amount of women as men working full-time, because that provides a distorted picture. And it really, again, feeds into this thing that it's not about choice. We have policy settings, we have structural conditions which have men being favoured more in roles which are full-time, where men's work is more traditionally full-time, and traditionally women's work is the type of work which is more geared towards part-time.
Absolutely. This is a better understanding of gender, economic gender inequality in Australia and the world, really. But let's get to the other point about senior roles as well, because I think there's something less quantifiable here, or something we didn't quite quantify here, which is gender bias in hiring practices. There's this expectation out there that when you think of an authority figure, you're thinking of an older white man, mostly, probably, right? No, but and when you're hiring for a position, a senior position, someone with authority, that's probably who you're expecting to see. We also know that women are less likely to ask for pay rises and be promoted. There's an expectation that men are going to do that, and because of that, it's more acceptable.
And we see this across all occupations. It's not just traditionally male-dominated ones, even in women-dominated ones. If you look at the breakdowns of workers in each occupation, then look at, say, the breakdowns in tax brackets, men are always overrepresented in the higher tax bracket, in the workers earning over 120,000, over 180,000. that means in the senior, in the management roles, men are much more likely to be in those roles, and it doesn't matter whether it is an occupation with 80% of men or 30% men. Men are much more likely to be seen in these roles. And as Eliza sort of noted, because they're seen in those roles, it just becomes a vicious circle where, men are just assumed to be the ones who will get those roles. Women feel less likely to almost even aim for those roles. And it's something where things like quotas we've seen in the corporate sector and even in things like in politics have been really helpful, just kind of smashing through that a bit and actually getting it to the point where people start thinking, actually, this is the natural way of thing, that there should be at least 50-50 in all roles, whether it's in junior roles or if it's in senior management, that this is not something that needs to be overcome, but it's something that is just there. What we've also seen with this, and you see it in the data, is that very much in some sectors, there becomes a bit of a boys' club, not just in sort of in areas that you might think, they're typically a man's job, but in very highly skilled, highly paid occupations, whether it be in medicine, whether it be in law, in economics and accountancy, things like that, electricians,
tradies, yeah.
Where men are the ones who are in charge of deciding who is going to get promoted. There can very much be that role of thinking, well, when I was promoted, men were favoured, and it becomes a bit of a boys' network.
Just going back to this point about women not asking for raises, this is not the fault of women. Obviously, this is a cultural expectation. It's something that I've internalized. It's probably something that you've internalized. We all accept and promote the culture that we're part of. And the fact that women don't feel confident and comfortable asking for raises has a lot to do with the way that we're socialized, both men and women. And then it becomes a less acceptable thing for women to do in the workplace. And actually, they're probably less likely to get a raise when they ask for it, because it's not the type of behavior we want to or expect to see from women. Myth number 5. Women choose to work in less dangerous and less skilled work, and that's why the gender pay gap exists.
Yeah, another great one that we often hear, that work in the mines that's highly paid. Well, that's the type of thing that men want to do, and women really don't want to do that, even though this bloke certainly doesn't want to do it either. It's a measure of two things. One, it's completely false. But also it feeds into what does our economy value. Our economy seems to value these notionally dangerous jobs, and they have a very warped view of what is skill. And so there's this view that being a mining engineer is highly skilled and should be highly paid. Being a care worker, that's not skill. Anyone can do that, despite the fact that very few people would actually do it if they were faced with the proposition of having to do it, because it is a hell of a hard job. It does require a level of skill, and it's something that not everyone can do, except we've decided to value one thing higher than the other.
Guess why we've decided to value them differently?
Yes.
Because men traditionally have done this type of dangerous mining, tradey kind of construction work, and women have traditionally done caring work. And because of the way that we value the contribution that men and women make to society, that's really fed into the way that we financially value these types of work. The other thing that I would add is that let's think about profit margins in different industries as well, like mining, electricians, other types of tradies, construction, really high profit margin there. So they're actually able to pay much higher wages, whereas in the care sector, we know that the profit margins are much slimmer, although they still exist and there's a lot of exploitation in those areas too. Of course, those workers absolutely should be paid more, and that feeds into some of our recommendations. But we don't value care work because women have traditionally done it, and also there's a lot less money in providing those services rather than producing goods, which men have traditionally done. Even
within that, it's not just about skill. If we think about some occupations which I think everyone would regard as requiring an incredible amount of skill, such as being a pediatrician or being a gynecologist, these are actually occupations where women are more dominant than men. There's more women working in these professions than men are, and yet the women are lower paid than men are. So it really has nothing to do with skill. It doesn't matter whether it's traditionally low skilled, traditionally high skilled, whatever. It doesn't matter whether you need university, whether you can do the job straight out of school. It doesn't matter. The gender pay gap exists across 95% of all occupations. Doesn't matter whether it's dominated by men, whether it's high paid, low paid, middle paid, long hours, short hours. It exists everywhere.
Exactly.
And another thing is, what we think of as dangerous occupations is also very much biased towards these male things where, oh, we're going to get injured. But actually, a great number of women-dominated occupations are also very dangerous.
That's totally correct. Like, if you think about a care worker in a childcare centre, there are a lot of hazards there. You're also incredibly high stakes. You're looking after the life of a human being that's prone to, getting hurt potentially. Also, nurses in hospitals, a very dangerous job. Yeah, just this idea that, you could, that men are the only ones doing dangerous jobs is a total misconception.
Myth number 6 is our favourite, is that if there really was a gender pay gap, well, companies would hire women more because they cost less.
Yeah, it's probably one of the silliest ones, I'd say. I mean, coming back to the point we made at the start, it is illegal to pay men and women different wages if they're doing the same work. So, a firm doesn't really have an incentive to hire a woman over a man if it's for a specific job that there are other men and women doing in the workplace.
So now that we're hopefully all on the same page about the gender pay gap, what can the government do about it, Eliza?
There are a lot of policies the government could implement to improve gender economic equality in Australia. First of all, we could have greater access to free or more affordable early childhood education and care. Australia Institute research shows that if Australia had the same labour force participation rates as Nordic countries do, then the economy would be $60 billion larger.
Yep. We could have more paid parental leave for both parents. That would also boost women's wages. With a 20-week scheme, Australia unsurprisingly ranks really low internationally, about 30th out of the 38 OECD countries, worse than Chile, on par with Colombia and Costa Rica. Extending leave entitlements and encouraging a more even distribution of childcare would help reduce the career and financial penalty of having children for all parents, but especially women.
Another policy that would help the gender pay gap is making it mandatory for superannuation to be paid while the person is on paid parental leave. Also, greater family-friendly work practices like flexible working arrangements and deliberate policies to lift wages in industries dominated by women, such as aged care and early childhood education and care, and to address insecure work will also help reduce the wage gap and help with reducing entrenched gender segregation by industry and occupation.